Hi, everybody. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and today we are going to talk about truth and institutions. The Gemara in Sanhedrin on Daf Mem Daled Amud Bet discusses a situation where witnesses admit that they lied, made a mistake, they renege in one form or another, and yet the person, based on their testimony, who is being put to death, gets put to death anyway. Why? Because they admitted it too late. So this is a really confounding ethical problem. The confounding ethical problem is if you have an institution such as beit that is meant to uphold the truth. And on the one hand, there is a local truth, which is this person who's about to be put to death is not actually guilty. The witnesses even admitted that they lied or that they made a mistake, but they did it too late. They did it after Drisha and Chakira was over. They did it after the investigation of their testimony was over. They did it when the person was being brought out to the gallows. But truth is that this person shouldn't die. On the other hand, if that happens, where you pull the person back and they don't get the death penalty, then what you've now done is you've effectively undermined the institution of Drisha and Chakira. You've undermined the believability of the original testimony. You've undermined the institution of beit din. And the institution of beit din is meant to uphold truth, certainly in the long run. So we have ourselves a little bit of a moral conundrum. And I want to dig into this moral conundrum in two ways. One is the Gemara, as it's describing the situation, mentions the din of Kevan Shehigid Shuv Eno Chozer Magid, or Kevan Shehigid Shuv Eno Chozer Magid. Once witnesses have testified, they cannot go back and change their testimony in a substantive way. That's one thing that the Gemara mentions. And a second thing the Gemara mentions is even in a case where they give an excuse as to why their first testimony shouldn't make sense, similar to, the Gemara says, the case of the mochis, the tax collector. And Rashi gives us this wild explanation of what that's talking about, where it seems to be that Shimon ben Shetach, by hook or by crook, his son ends up getting framed by some Edim who are Edei Sheker, false witnesses, because they're trying to get back at Shimon ben Shetach. So we're going to look at that story too. Those are the two things I want to do. I want to talk about the logic of Kevan Shehigid Shuv Eno Chozer Magid, that once testimony has been given, those witnesses cannot change their testimony substantively. And I want to talk about this ma'aseh with Shimon ben Shetach's son, where the Edim admitted that they lied. Okay, sort of building blocks on each other. So let's start with Kevan Shehigid Shuv Eno Chozer Magid. So the earliest place, I believe, in Chazal that we see this logic offered is in the Tosefta in Ketubot. Okay, the Tosefta in Ketubot, Parak Bet, Tosefta, section Aleph. I just realized I need to share my screen. Says as follows. Let's make this bigger for everybody. Okay. Zeu klalo shel davar. Here's the general principle. Edim shehidu letamei uletaher lerachek ulekarev leesor ulatir liftor ulechayev. Edim who come and give edun on status, right? Impure, pure, not pedigreed, meaning for family purposes, for lineage purposes, prohibited, permitted, exempt, responsible, any of that. If before they go through the chakirot, right, before they go through full examination in beit din, which we know what those are because we learned them, amru ba'de'inanu, they said, we made it up. We believe them. But mi shenech karei dutan bebeit din, But once the chakira happens, amru bada inanu, if they say we made it up, einan nemanin, we don't believe them, right? So I look at that and I say to myself, actually, in some ways, this is preserving truth, because otherwise, anybody can come say anything. We take them seriously. We go for it. They come later and they say, oh, we were actually lying. What was the purpose of this whole thing? Right? What was the purpose of this whole thing? But I want to go a little bit into the logic. So first thing is, Kevan Shehigid Shuveinu Choser Bagid. Where's that language come from? It comes from a pasuk in Vayikra. Vayikra Hey describes the problem of somebody who knows edut, who knows testimony, but doesn't come and give it. V'nefesh ki techeta v'shama kol ala v'hu eid o ra'a o yada im lo yagid v'nasa abono. It's a little confusing because there are a number of different subjects here, right? If somebody does a sin and somebody else knows about it and could give edut and has heard, cursed is somebody who doesn't bring edut on this, but decides im lo yagid, they decide not to bring edut anyway. That's where the lashon of Haggadah comes from. They are liable to punishment. It's a sin not to give testimony if you have it, if you know it. Now, we have this same pasuk being used when Rishonim try to explain why Kivan Shehigid Shuv Eno Chozer Magid, why a person, once they've given testimony, or I should say witnesses, a kat of witnesses, right? Once they've given testimony, can't change it substantively. How does it come from that same pasuk? So Rashi in Ketubot Yud Chet Amud Bet, for those who learn Ketubot, you'll remember this is the case of where people say, yes, that's my signature on that star, but I was forced, right? Which is an interesting question. Like, why isn't that changing substantively your testimony? But we'll get back to it. Rashi says, let me tell you how we get it from the pasuk, that Kevan Shehigid Shuv Eno Chozer Magid, that once you've given testimony, you can't substantively change it. Digabe edut, because regarding edut in that pasuk, Perek Hey, pasuk Aleph in Vayikra, Chada Haggadah Ktiva, it only says one Haggadah, one saying, one telling, meaning you testify once. And Rashi also says, I want to tell you what I might be worried about if I would let people go back and change their testimony. Rashi says, what's the problem? At least in our Sanhedrin, this is the way Rashi puts it. You might say the idea that they decide to say, look, we were wrong, or we were mistaken, we were lying, whatever it is, they decide to do another Haggadah that changes something substantively. Maybe to Amri ma lanu lachov b'damo. They might be saying to themselves, we don't want to put somebody to death, right? And that also might come from the pasuk. Why? Because look at what the Mishnah in Sanhedrin that we learned recently said. What do we tell the Eidim in a Dinei Nefashot case? V'shema tomru, you might say, Malanu l'tzara hazot. Why do we want to get involved in this thing of giving edut on this Dinei Nefashot case? V'halo kvar ne'emar. Well, there's a pasuk that says, V'hu eid o ra'a o yada im lo yagid v'gomer. We know that there is a sin not to tell, right? So what does Rashi say? The same way the pasuk of im lo yagid v'nasavono is telling you, you shouldn't say, I don't want to give testimony because I just don't want to get involved in this conflictual thing. Similarly, you shouldn't say if you gave testimony and on the basis of your testimony, beit is going forward with a punishment, you shouldn't turn around and renege and say, I don't want to be the reason why somebody gets punished, even if it's true. So for Rashi, he actually thinks we're preserving the truth by not letting people renege on their edut, because maybe the reason they're reneging is because they are uncomfortable with someone being punished, right? Now, another explanation that goes in a different direction is the Chidushei HaRitva. The Ritva says, actually, the issue is the reason why I'm not letting somebody renege on the edut that they gave, or the edim renege on the edim that they gave, says Perish de lo yagid, this idea of using lo yagid, and the way that he uses it is a little different than Rashi. Rather than Rashi says it only says yagid once, the Ritva says it says yagid in the future, meaning if you haven't set it up to now, you can't say it in the future, right? And that's how he learns If you didn't say it this way in your first Haggadah, you can't change it in your second Haggadah because lo yagid in the future. So he says, let me tell you why. Midikatav al pi shnaim edim yakum davar, right? Because it says in the Torah, based on two witnesses, something is established. Alma al masha yidu bebeitin yitkayem hadin l'schut o l'chiyuv la'alter. Meaning, what they said, what they testified already in Beitin, immediately has teeth. Immediately, that is the reality. That is the truth. Ve'im yecholim lachazor ulaha'id, and if they can just go back and change it, yakum davar. How would you say that something is established, right? What makes it established if you can always go back and change it? Now, to me, I think that's very interesting because to me, that speaks a little bit more to the protection of the institution of Beit Din, right? The institution of Beit Din relies on two Eidim that can establish reality. Once that reality has been established, we don't question it. We leave it as is, right? We leave it as is. And if you're going to not do that, then how is this institution supposed to function with transparent rules and standards, right? So I see these as two different explanations, right? Rashi seems to be worried that they're going to change their mind in terms of their Haggadah. Why? Because they're worried about putting somebody to death. So basically, the second time it's going to lie. It's not the first time; it's the second time when they're going to lie. Whereas the Ritva seems to be saying we're protecting Beit Din. I mean, they're two Eidim establish reality, and that's the way it goes. I think there's probably another way that we could put this, which is we might just be worried about people, maybe it sticks in the same. Maybe it stays in the same. This is me thinking a little bit in pencil. I'm sorry about that. But suffice it to say, this is definitely useful for thinking about how we protect truth, right? We're protecting truth in the short run. We're protecting truth in the long run. We're protecting an institution that is supposed to give us truth, right? So that's the first thing that I think Kivan Shehigid Shuvin Choser Magid already brings to us. I want to talk about some of the maybe, I don't know if it's even fair to say that they're fully exceptions to the rule because not everyone agrees to them, but possible exceptions to the rule, plausibly thought of as exceptions to the rule. The first is brought down by the Rambam. So Rambam says, Kol eid shenechkara iduto bebeitin, bein bedinei mamonot, bein bedinei nefashot, ein yachol lachzor bo. Anyone who's had the edut already examined through the chakirot, doesn't matter if it's a financial case, it doesn't matter if it's a capital case, you can't go back on it. Ketzad. How so? Amar mut'eh hayiti, shogeg hayiti, v'nizkarti she'ena davar kain. Let's say the person says, I was mistaken. I was ignorant about something, and now I remember that, I forgot, and now I remember that it wasn't true. I did it to scare the person. Ein shomin. You don't listen to them. Afilu natan tam l'dvara. Right? Now we're already getting to the second part of our original Gemara, right? Not just Kevan Shegid Shuva and Choser Magid. It's even if they can give you an excuse for why it was this way. We'll get back to it. And the person also can't add, anything that relates to conditions on their edut. Bottom line, after Chakira, anything that would substantively change it or renege on it, it's a no-go. And then the Rambam brings down the case that I mentioned before in Ketubot, Daf Yud Chen Amud Bet. Eidim hachatumin al ashtar, if you have eidim who are signed onto a document, harein kimishin achkarei edutan bebeitin, ve'en yochalin lachzor behem. It's as though their edut has actually gone through chakirot, and therefore they cannot renege, right? That's significance of a shtar. They can't renege on what they signed on to. But when is this the case? That's only if we are able to verify their signatures without them. For example, there are other idim who say, we recognize these signatures, or we have, some exemplar of their signature to compare it to. But if we can only rely on the witnesses who are signed on the shtar to tell us that it's really their handwriting, and they say, this is indeed our handwriting. But we were forced. We were minors. We were related to the people involved. We were mistaken. They are believed, and the shtar is nullified. Right? So that seems to be an exception to the case of Kevan Shehigit Shuv Enochozer Magid, probably because you might actually consider it a Haggadah Achat, right? You might consider it one Haggadah because they are telling you this is our signature. And by telling you that, they're essentially retestifying to what's in the shtar. And at the same time, Toch Ketei Dibor, they're saying, but we were forced to do this, but we were minors, but we were mistaken. So maybe that's one Haggadah, right? So that's an interesting example of where we're basically saying, look, we're not standing on ceremony. We're not formalists. We're actually trying to get at the truth here. Okay? Another example that I think is interesting is one that we saw towards the end of Baba Batra, right? Towards the end of Baba Batra, there was this really colorful story where a woman, we were talking about the payment of a ketubah, right? For a woman who was divorced or an almana, okay? So it says as follows. So there's a certain, receipt for ketubah payment that Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba had signed. And the woman who actually got the ketubah payment, who was on that receipt, went in front of Rav Yirmiyah and says, Amar le lav anahavai. I'm not that same woman. Amar, and so he says, Ananami Amar lahu lav ihihi. So I testified, nope, that's not that woman. Right? So a Haggadah, he's testifying that. Va'amar li, and they said to me, Mikashu dekashala, uvagar lakala. You're actually mistaken. But you don't realize it is the same woman. But she's just gotten older. And her voice sounds more just older, like garrulous, right? So Abaye then says, Afagav de Amar Rabbanan, even though the rabbis usually say, Kevan Shehigit Shuvin Chozer Magid, that once you've testified, you can't retestify, you can't renege, you can't change substantively your edut. Rabbanan, because this person is a Torah scholar, lav orche lemeidak, you're probably not noticing what exactly a woman looks like and what exactly a woman sounds like, right? So we're willing to say, even though usually Kevan Shehigit Shuvin Chozer Magid, we have a reason to say that the first Haggadah, actually, when he thought it wasn't her, he was just mistaken, right? And I do think that it's just so interesting that here's an example. We've talked a lot in the past shiurim about umdina versus umdina demuchach, or omed debarur, meaning the ideas of things that are like objectively the case versus subjectively the case. It seems like the difference between somebody saying, well, I was lying and I'll tell you why, where we say, I'm sorry, Aid, we don't believe you. You already gave your edut, and either we're worried that you're lying now, we're worried that you're reneging, because you don't want them to get punished, or because we need to protect beitin, and that's what edut is, and you said it, and it's kayam, and that's just what it is. We don't take their word for it, but in this case, with the Tzurva Mirabanan, it's almost like, it's a presumed fact. It's a presumption that we all hold that this male Torah scholar is not going to know what women look like so well, and so they probably made a mistake, right? So the difference between somebody subjectively saying, I came and I lied, versus, a kind of objective presumed, fact about the world and about people, seems like that's the difference between whether someone can actually renege or not. Now, I say this is an exception, but it's not such an exception. Like the Rambam doesn't bring this down, Halakha, which I think is interesting. Shulchan Aruch, by the way, The Rama does, but in context specifically of talking about ketubot, not in context of talking about edut generally. It's interesting in and of itself, right? So let's say this is part one of our big moral question, the relationship between truth and relationships, truth and institutions, sorry. One thing that we see, Kavan Shehigid, Shuv Enochozer Magid, what we're trying to protect is truth. We're trying to protect the function of the Chakira, right? The Chakirot are supposed to establish truth. And once they've been established, we stay where we are. Now, if you know, as in our case in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Mem Dalet Amud Bet, that this is wrong. It shouldn't happen. It shouldn't be. They admitted it. Even then, we're saying, no, we're protecting the truth. And what I'm noticing is that when we say we're protecting the truth, there's kind of two ways that it goes. One way that it goes is we're protecting the local truth here. And we're saying, we don't really believe you, Adim, even when you're telling us that you were lying. We just don't believe you. We think you don't want someone to get hurt, or maybe there's whatever the reason is, we don't believe you, right? Another is we have to protect the protocols of beit, because the protocols of beit are ultimately will allow us to get at the truth 99% of the time, right? This 1%, or I don't know, 99.99% of the time, this 0.01%, it's sad, but that's just part of what it means to be in an institution, right? So those are two ways to look at it. I want to spend a few minutes also looking at this wacky story with Shimon ben Shetach, because it isn't just that it seems like some no-goodniks set up Shimon ben Shetach's son in a capital case, but it's that actually it's almost like a very Akeda Yitzchak-like, according to the Midrash, that Shimon ben Shetach's son volunteered to allow himself to be the korban, which is interesting, right? So I want to start with something that's not, something that Rashi quoted, and it's not in the Yerushalmi that Rashi's big story that he has on the side is based on, which is we have a statement in Pirkei Avot where Shimon ben Shetach says, Shimon ben Shetach Omer have a marbelach korat ha'edim. Examine those edim very well. Veheve zahir b'dvarecha, and be careful with how you're talking to them, because Shema mitocham yomedu l'shaker. They might figure out how to lie effectively based on information that you give them. It is certainly interesting that Shimon ben Shetach, whose son gets, whose son goes on death row because of false edim, it is interesting that he is the person saying this. Now, the story of his son going on death row because of false edim shows up in the Yerushalmi and Sanhedrin, Vav Gimel, and it goes like this. Shimon ben Shetach hayu yadav chamumot. Shimon ben Shetach's hands were hot, which people explain as he was being too quick to put people to death in his beit din. Now, is that a reference to the 80 witches that he put to death in a day? Rashi clearly is connecting them in the Gemara and Sanhedrin, for those who saw it. Atasiyat le'tanin Amre, and a group of no-goodniks came and said, Havu etza nishod al brei v'niktalinhe. Let's bear false testimony against his son and get his son killed. Ashidu alai. So they did. They bore false testimony against him. V'nigmar dino lehareg. And it was decided by the court, execution, right? So they're trying to get Shimon ben Shetach back for being too willing to put people to death quickly by utilizing that same system to get his son put to death. Mi nafak lemitkala amrile, when he was being brought out to be executed, they said, Mare shikrin anan, we lied. By avoy machzarte. And their father, Shimon ben Shetach, his father, rather, Shimon ben Shetach, wanted to bring him back. Amarle, and the son says to him, Abba, my father, im bikashta lavo chua al yadach, ase oti ke'iskapa. Now, how you read this exactly, hard to know, but let's just say, if you want to follow the letter of the law, I'm game to be the korban. Meaning, if we don't want to bring me back from death row because the letter of the law is kevan shehigid shuvin chozer magid, even when they explain what their reasoning is, I'm willing to be the korban. Right? That's it. It reads very differently than our Gemara in Sanhedrin, where essentially what you have is the defendant who's being put on death row is protesting his imminent execution. And the rabbis are sort of like, well, I'm sorry, what are we going to do? Like, what are we going to do? This is it's the Edim's fault, meaning we al pishnaim edim yakum davar. Like, we need the two Edim, we need to be able to trust that they're establishing truth. That's what our institution is. It reads very differently when the defendant himself, Shimon ben Shetach's son here, says, I'm willing to be put to death, even though I know that this isn't locally true, but it's going to uphold the institution of beit din, which, in the long run is truth. Now, I look at this, and clearly Rashi said he connects the idea that, Shimon ben Shetach was quick to put people to death to another example, which shows up in the Yerushalmi in Perek Vav in Sanhedrin, which is he put 80 witches to death on the same day. Now, how you do the kind of due process that you're supposed to have in the Gemara and that the Mishnayot and the Gemara had been describing, you can't really do that if you're putting 80 people to death in one day. And one of the things that I wonder is if you hitch these two stories to each other and say, these Edim were relatives of the 80 witches who Shimon ben Shetach put to death, and they wanted to show him, well, you're playing fast and loose with beit din, so we're going to play fast and loose with beit din. And the only way to kind of end it is by being willing to allow his son to be sacrificed. I am wondering, is there any rebuke of Shimon ben Shetach for putting 80 people to death in one day, right? Like, was that a misuse of beit din, right? Because the institution is supposed to be slow and methodical, and right. And so I think when you look at the Yerushalmi that tells the story of him putting 80 women to death in one day, the Yerushalmi does not seem to be bothered by what he did, right? Hainu did taninan, shmonim nashim tala Shimon ben Shetach ba'Ashkelon, right? Shimon ben Shetach, hanged 80 women, and they were witches in Ashkelon on the same day. Ve'ein danan shnayim b'yom echad, ela shehashat tzricha lachen. Right? Generally, we don't try more than one person. We don't execute more than one person on one day. Try more than one person on one day, but in this case, it was needed, right? So that makes it sound like it's actually legitimating it, and it's very sad that some scoffers came along and turned it around on Shimon ben Shetach and endangered his son. But I do wonder when I look at the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, not the Yerushalmi, but when I look at the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, I do wonder whether Shimon ben Shetach killing 80 people on one day in Beit Din was considered something that was problematic. Because look at what we have here. Okay, the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, Perek Vav, is describing how Tzliya is done, how a certain aspect of the execution is done, okay? Meaning not an aspect of the execution, the hanging of the body after the execution is done. And so Chachamim say, Rabbi Eliezer describes that you would, do the Tzliya differently for men and for women. V'chachamim omrim ha'ish nitle ve'ein ha'isha nitlet. No. Men have their bodies shown after their execution, and they are kept up there, probably like in a crucifixion kind of way, but women are not. Amar lehen Rabbi Eliezer, but then Rabbi Eliezer says, no, but Havalo Shimon ben Shetach tala nashim ba'Ashkelon. Didn't Shimon ben Shetach, it says that he you know, hanged these women in Ashkelon, right? It didn't just say he executed them. It says he, you know, put them up for everyone to see. Amrulo, and the response to Rabbi Eliezer from Chachamim is Shmonim Nashim Tala. He um, hanged 80 women, ve'in danin shnai b'yom echad, but you're not even allowed to uh, judge two people in a day in dinei nefasha, right? So is that a rebuke of Shimon ben Shetach? Is that simply, well, that's what the hour needed? I'm not really sure, but I do think that whether it's Shimon ben Shetach saying, we've got to check those Edim very, very carefully, or it's his son saying, I'm going to be willing to go to my death, even though it's not fair, right? To kind of protect Beit Din. Or it's the question of, you know, Shimon ben Shetach, would he ever do that again? Should he have done that by putting 80 people to death in one day? You definitely get the sense that the question of how you get to truth in the long run and how you get to truth in the short run in some ways is being navigated here. And I don't think it's an easy answer. And it can be painful, certainly, at times. So I think I'm going to leave it there in our ruminations. Thanks, everybody. Looking forward to learning with you next time.